The Earth doesn't just shake, it convulses. It is a living, tortured thing, churned into a primordial soup of frozen mud, splintered trees, and metal fragments. The air is thick, a poisonous cocktail of cordite, diesel fumes, and the coppery tang of fear. This is the Eastern Front, the winter of 1943, a meat grinder on a continental scale where the fate of the world is being decided in a brutal, unrelenting stalemate. And here, in this god-forsaken stretch of land near a city soon to be immortalized in the annals of warfare, Kursk, the Soviet Red Army is on the brink of being gutted. The German war machine, a seemingly unstoppable juggernaut of steel and fire, is carving its way through Soviet defenses. Their new weapons, the monstrous Panther and Tiger tanks, are like steel demons emerging from the smoke, their long-barreled cannons spitting death with terrifying accuracy. Soviet T-34s, the workhorses of the Red Army, are burning like torches, their armor proving tragically inadequate against the German onslaught. The sound is a deafening symphony of hell. The sharp crack of an 88mm shell, the thump of impacting mortar rounds, the desperate rattle of machine guns, and beneath it all, the guttural, grinding roar of engines pushed beyond their limits. In the midst of this chaos, amidst the screaming men in the burning steel, one man is not firing a cannon. He is not charging with a rifle. He is on his back, buried in the frozen muck beneath the shuddering hull of a crippled T-34, his world reduced to the smell of grease, hot metal, and his own cold sweat. His name is Ivan Kravchenko, a senior sergeant, a tank mechanic. And as the German panzers close in for the kill, as the very ground seems to be dissolving under the weight of the enemy advance, the entire course of this titanic battle is about to hinge not on a general's order or a politician's decree, but on the grease-stained hands of this one forgotten man. Could a simple mechanic, armed with nothing but a wrench and a desperate, flickering spark of ingenuity, possibly stand against the might of the entire Wehrmacht? The odds were not just impossible, they were laughable. But history often turns on such absurdities. As the shadows of the German giants fell over his position, Ivan's mind raced, his fingers probing the mangled guts of the machine above him, searching for a miracle in a world that had run out of them. He had one tank, one chance, and a terrifying question echoing in his soul. What could one man do when everything was already lost? The T-34, designated White 04, was a tomb. Its crew dragged out moments before, bleeding and broken. A German shell had found its mark, not a killing blow, but a crippling one. It had sheared through the drive sprocket, mangled the final drive, and left the 32-ton beast listing in the cratered earth like a wounded animal. To any other man, it was just another piece of scrap metal, waiting for the salvage crews that would never come. But to Ivan, it was a puzzle. It was his responsibility. He knew every bolt, every gear, every vulnerable seam in its armor. He had personally tuned its V12 diesel engine until it purred like a contented beast. Now, that beast was silent, and its silence was a death knell. He could hear the battle raging just a few hundred yards away, the crump of explosions walking closer, the distinct, terrifying sound of German MG-42s, the Hitler's buzzsaw, chewing through the infantry positions that were supposed to be protecting him. He was alone, but for his assistant, a young, wide-eyed private named Pavel, whose hands trembled so badly he could barely hold a tool. "Sergeant, we have to fall back," Pavel pleaded, his voice a reedy squeak against the basso profundo of the bombardment. "The infantry is pulling out. They've left us." Ivan didn't look up. His focus was absolute, a laser beam of concentration in the storm. He was listening, not just to the panic in the boy's voice, but to the sounds of the enemy. He could differentiate between the high-velocity crack of the Panther's 75mm and the earth-shattering blast of the Tiger's 88. He could track their advance by sound alone. And he knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, that if they broke through this final crumbling line of defense, the entire Soviet flank would collapse. The Germans would pour through the gap, encircling entire armies, and the road to Moscow would be laid there. The stakes were that high. The fate of millions rested on this muddy, insignificant patch of ground, and all that stood in the way was a mechanic and his broken tank. He wiped a greasy sleeve across his face, leaving a black smear. "Give me the large wrench, Pavel," he said, his voice unnervingly calm, "and stop shaking. The Germans are not interested in your fear." He then uttered words that would have seemed like madness to anyone else, a statement of such profound absurdity it defied the reality exploding around them. "We are not leaving. We are going to fix her, and then we are going to fight." The look on Pavel's face was one of pure, unadulterated terror. But beneath the terror, something else flickered, a spark, fanned by the sheer, audacious will of the man lying in the mud. The first impossible step had been taken. The decision was made. Now, all they had to do was the impossible, with the enemy closing in for the kill, and time running out faster than the blood from the wounded lying in the field behind them. The first German machine gun bullets began to snap and whine overhead, stitching the air just above the hull of the dormant T-34, a deadly reminder that their sanctuary was about to become a death trap. The metallic spang of bullets ricocheting off the T-34's hardened steel hull was a sound that drilled directly into the spine. It was a high-pitched, violent ringing that promised a swift and messy death. Pavel flinched, ducking his head instinctively, but Ivan merely grunted, his entire upper body still submerged in the tight, dark cavity of the tank's rear compartment. His world was a universe of oil, twisted metal, and the acrid smell of burnt wiring. The German infantry were probing forward, their advance covered by the overwhelming firepower of the panzers. Soon, they would be on top of the position. Ivan's mind, however, was a world away from the whining bullets. It was a blueprint, a three-dimensional schematic of the T-34's transmission and final drive assembly. He could see it in his mind's eye with a clarity that bordered on the supernatural. Every gear, every bearing, every spline shaft. The problem was catastrophic. The shell impact had not only shattered the drive sprocket, but had sent a shockwave through the gearbox, jamming the primary pinion gear and likely cracking the housing. A repair under ideal conditions, in a warm, well-lit depot with a full machine shop and a team of engineers, would take days. He had minutes. And he had a toolbox, a terrified assistant, and the burning wreckage of other tanks for spare parts. It was a recipe for suicide. "Pavel," Ivan barked, his voice muffled by the engine block. "The sledgehammer, now! And find me a track link, a good one, not bent." The order was so bizarre it cut through the boy's panic. A sledgehammer? A track link? They were mechanics, not blacksmiths. But Ivan's logic was born of a desperate kind of genius. He couldn't fix the delicate, precision-machined gears, not here, not now. So he wouldn't. He was going to bypass them. His plan was audacious, reckless, and defied every engineering manual ever written. If the power from the engine couldn't get to the drive wheel through the broken transmission, he would lock the final drive solid. He would, in effect, turn the T-34 into a giant 32-ton battering ram with only one gear, forward. It would put unimaginable strain on the engine. It would make steering nearly impossible. It would be a short, violent, and brutal life for the machine. But it would move. And a moving tank, even a crippled one, was a weapon. A stationary tank was just a target. The physical labor was Herculean. Ivan, with Pavel struggling to help, had to first remove the shredded remnants of the old drive sprocket. The bolts were fused by heat and impact, and they screamed in protest as he applied the wrench, putting his entire weight into it. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, despite the freezing temperature. Each blow of the sledgehammer against the stubborn housing sent jolts of pain up his arms. It was a race against the most ruthless opponent of all, time. The German fire was intensifying. He could hear the guttural shouts of enemy soldiers now, mixed with the desperate last stands of Soviet riflemen. A mortar shell landed 30 yards away, the concussion wave slamming into the tank's hull and showering them with dirt and debris. Pavel cried out, but Ivan just spat a glob of mud and blood from his lip and kept working. His hands were raw, bleeding, the grease and dirt ground deep into the cuts. He was operating on something beyond training, beyond even courage. It was a primal, stubborn refusal to let the metal win. He was a master confronting a broken instrument, and he would make it sing one last, terrible song. Finally, with a shriek of tortured metal, the broken sprocket came free. Now for the truly insane part. Using heavy steel cables scavenged from a wrecked supply truck, he began to rig a makeshift linkage, connecting the main output shaft directly to the drive wheel hub using the sturdy track link as a crude locking mechanism. It was a brutalist solution, an act of mechanical violence. He wasn't repairing, he was grafting, creating a monstrous hybrid of tank and torpedo. As he tightened the final bolt, his knuckles white with strain, he heard a new sound that froze the blood in his veins. It was not the high-pitched whine of bullets or the crump of mortars. It was the deep, resonant, grinding clatter of steel tracks on hard ground. Heavy steel tracks. It was close, too close. He slowly pulled himself out from under the tank, his muscles screaming in protest. He wiped his hands on his grimy coveralls and peered over the scarred hull. There, emerging from the smoke and haze like a mythological beast, was a German Tiger tank. Its colossal, boxy silhouette was unmistakable, its long 88mm cannon slowly traversing, hunting for targets. It was less than 200 yards away, a king of the battlefield, utterly unaware of the mechanic and his cobbled-together monstrosity. Ivan's heart hammered against his ribs. The Tiger was accompanied by a squad of Panzergrenadiers, their figures dark and menacing in the swirling dust. They were moving parallel to his position, their attention focused on the retreating Soviet infantry in the distance. For a moment, they hadn't seen him. WW2 was partially concealed in a shell crater and by the smoke from a burning fuel dump. They had a few seconds of grace. Ivan looked at Pavel, whose face was a mask of pure, petrified horror. He looked at the jury-rigged transmission, a mess of cables in a locked gear. He looked back at the Tiger, 100 tons of invincible German engineering. He had given the tank a pulse, a crude, violent life, but could he wake the beast without immediately signing his death warrant? One sound, one misfire, one puff of smoke at the wrong time, and the Tiger's cannon would swivel and erase them from the earth in a fireball of molten steel. He had to get into the tank, start the engine, and pray his brutal fix would hold for at least one charge. But the hatch was on the far side, the side the Tiger is on. To reach it, he would have to step out into the open, fully exposed. The mechanic's work was done. Now, the soldier's gamble was about to begin. A deadly game of cat and mouse, where he was both the mouse and, impossibly, the only cat left on the field. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air tasting of ash and destiny, and prepared to make the dash of his life. Every instinct screamed at Ivan to stay down, to press his body into the cold, forgiving mud and become one with the earth. But that was the path of the victim, the prey. He had not spent the last hour performing mechanical alchemy just to die cowering in a hole. He met Pavel's terrified eyes and pointed a greasy, determined finger towards the tank's rear deck. "When I move, you move. Straight to the hatch. Don't stop. Don't look back." The Tiger's engine roared, a deep diesel thunder that vibrated through the ground. Its commander was visible in the cupola, his head swiveling, a pair of field glasses raised to his eyes. He was scanning the tree line ahead, completely oblivious to the threat, or what he would have considered the insignificant wreck, to his immediate flank. This was it, the moment of maximum vulnerability. Ivan coiled his legs beneath him, every muscle tense. He was no longer a mechanic. He was a predator about to spring a trap. With a final sharp nod to Pavel, he exploded from cover. The world erupted into a terrifying clarity. The mud sucked at his boots, trying to pull him down. The air seemed to thicken, each stride feeling agonizingly slow. He kept his eyes locked on the commander's cupola of the Tiger, a mere 150 yards away. If that head turned, if those field glasses dipped even a fraction, it was over. He could hear Pavel's ragged breathing right behind him. 5 yards, 10. The side hull of the T-34 was right there, a wall of scarred green steel offering salvation and potential doom. He reached it, his hands slapping against the cold, rough surface. Pavel scrambled up beside him, fumbling for the hatch release. The squeal of the metal hinge sounded like a scream in the relative quiet. Ivan risked one more glance. The Tiger commander was still looking away, pointing towards the Soviet lines, shouting an order to his crew. They had made it. For now, they tumbled into the tank's dark, claustrophobic interior, the familiar smells of oil, cordite, and cold sweat greeting them like a ghost. Ivan slammed the hatch shut, plunging them into near darkness, punctuated only by the thin slivers of light from the vision slits. The inside of WW2 was a tomb that had been violently disturbed. Spent shell casings rolled on the floor. A half-eaten piece of black bread lay on the radio operator's seat. The coppery smell of blood was faint but present. This was someone else's home, someone else's coffin, and now it was theirs. Ivan didn't pause for reflection. He shoved Pavel towards the driver's position. "You know the basics. When I give the signal, you push the left steering lever, hard. Don't think, just do it." He himself clambered into the commander's seat, his hands moving over the familiar controls with a practiced ease that belied the pounding of his heart. This was the moment of truth. His repair, his abomination of engineering, was about to be tested. He primed the engine, his finger hovering over the starter button. He could hear the Tiger outside, its engine idling, a giant purring just feet away. One wrong move, one backfire, one unusual sound, and they would be discovered. He took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to the god of mechanics and desperate men, and pushed the button. The engine coughed once, a sound that seemed to echo across the battlefield. Then it roared to life. The whole tank shuddered, the V12 diesel bellowing with a raw, untamed power that was music to Ivan's ears. But immediately he knew something was wrong, terribly wrong. A deafening, grinding, gnashing scream erupted from the rear of the tank, a sound of metal eating itself alive. His makeshift linkage was failing before they had even moved an inch. Thick, black smoke began to pour into the fighting compartment, acrid and choking. Pavel screamed, "Sergeant, it's breaking!" Outside, the sound had not gone unnoticed. The Tiger's commander's head snapped around. Ivan, peering through his vision slit, saw the man's face clearly for the first time. A hard, experienced face under a black Panzer officer's cap. His eyes wide with surprise, then narrowing into slits of lethal comprehension. They had been discovered. The Tiger's massive turret began to traverse, not with frantic speed, but with a slow, horrifying, deliberate purpose. The long 88mm barrel, a pipe of death, started to swing towards them. It was a race they were already losing. The Tiger's gunner would need only a few seconds to acquire the target and fire. At this range, the shell would pass through the T-34's frontal armor as if it were paper. They were trapped in a metal box, with a failing engine staring down the barrel of the most powerful tank gun on the battlefield. Ivan's mind raced, discarding one hopeless option after another. Bailing out meant being cut down by machine gun fire. Staying put meant being incinerated. His eyes darted across the controls, the smoke stinging his eyes. The transmission was screaming, a death rattle. But the engine was still running, still producing power. His fix was failing, but it wasn't dead yet. There was still power going to the tracks, but it was unbalanced, chaotic. He had one chance, one insane, physics-defying gamble. He wouldn't try to drive forward. He would try to spin. He slammed both hands down on the intercom button, his voice a raw shout over the mechanical cacophony. "Pavel, left lever, now, all the way back, hold it!" He simultaneously yanked the right steering lever forward, commanding the right track to power ahead while the left track locked and reversed. It was a maneuver that put unimaginable torque on the already failing final drive, a move that would tear a healthy T-34 apart. On a tank held together by prayers and steel cable, it was suicide. The T-34 shuddered violently, the grinding noise reaching a fever pitch. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a lurch that threw Ivan against the hard metal of the turret ring, the tank pivoted. It wasn't a smooth turn, it was a violent, jerking spin on its axis, like a top kicked by a giant. The world outside the vision slits became a dizzying blur of smoke, sky, and earth. Ivan lost all sense of direction. He was just holding on, praying that his desperate Gambit would throw off the Tiger's aim. The German gunner, tracking a stationary target, was suddenly confronted with a T-34 performing a frantic smoking pirouette. The 88mm cannon fired. The sound was apocalyptic, a physical blow to the ears. The shell passed so close to the turret that the wind of its passage whistled through the vision slits, a hot, sulphurous breath. It missed, slamming into the ground behind them and sending a geyser of dirt and stone high into the air. They were alive. But they are now broadside to the Tiger, a perfect barn door target. The German gunner would not miss twice. Ivan saw the Tiger's barrel adjusting, correcting, lining up for the killing shot. They had maybe 3 seconds. In the dizzying spin, Ivan's eyes caught a glimpse of their new orientation. They were now facing away from the Tiger, towards a small wooded gully. An idea, born of utter desperation, flashed in his mind. It was their only way out. But to reach it, he would have to perform another miracle, and this one would demand every last ounce of strength from the dying machine. "Pavel, both levers forward, full power!" he roared. The T-34, still trailing thick black smoke, lunged forward like a wounded bull, charging directly towards the gully as the Tiger's gun found its mark for the second time. The T-34's engine howled in protest, a wounded animal driven beyond its limits. The violent spin had placed them on a new trajectory, a desperate, headlong rush towards the tree line and the promise of the gully beyond. It was a shallow depression, more of a fold in the earth than a true ravine, but it offered the only cover for hundreds of yards. It was their sanctuary, their only chance. But it was 50 yards away. 50 yards of open, crater-pocked ground that might as well have been 50 miles. Behind them, the Tiger tank was an avatar of vengeance. The miss had been an embarrassment, a stain on the crew's honor. Now, they would be methodical, precise, and utterly merciless. Ivan, crammed in the commander's seat, could feel the German gunner's gaze like a physical weight. He didn't need to see the Tiger to know its turret was tracking them, the long 88mm barrel making microscopic adjustments. He could only watch the gully through his forward vision slit, a sliver of darker green and shadow that seemed to mock him by not getting closer fast enough. "Faster, Pavel, faster!" he yelled, though he knew the boy had the throttle pressed to the firewall. The tank was giving everything it had, but the mangled transmission was sapping its power, leaving a trail of black oil and metal shavings in their wake. Then came the sound he had been dreading, not the roar of the main gun, that would come a split second before death, but the higher-pitched, rapid thump-thump-thump of the Tiger's coaxial machine gun. Tracer rounds, glowing a malevolent green, streaked past the vision slits, stitching a line in the dirt ahead of them. It was a warning shot, a hunter toying with its prey, or, more likely, the gunner trying to force them to zigzag, to slow down, to make the final kill shot easier. "Don't swerve," Ivan commanded, his voice tight. "Straight line, they're trying to hurt us." It was a brutal test of nerve. To drive straight into a hail of machine gun fire felt like insanity. But to turn was to present a larger profile for the main gun, to waste precious seconds, to die. The machine gun bullets began to impact the hull, a sound like a dozen furious sledgehammers beating on a steel drum. Bang! Bang, bang, bang! The noise inside the fighting compartment was deafening, a hellish concerto of the screaming engine, the grinding transmission, and the relentless hammering of bullets on armor. A round punched through the thinner side armor near the driver's position with a sharp crack and a spray of molten metal. Pavel screamed as a fragment sliced across his arm. "I'm hit!" he shrieked, his hands instinctively pulling back from the controls. The tank began to slow. "Drive!" Ivan roared, his voice cutting through the panic like a knife. "It's a scratch! Drive, or we die!" The sheer force of the command pushed Pavel past the pain and terror. He shoved the levers forward again, his blood-slicked hands gripping the controls with a white-knuckled desperation. The gully was 20 yards away. 15. They were so close. Ivan risked a glance through the rear vision block. The Tiger was stationary, a monument of death. A puff of white smoke erupted from its muzzle brake. The main gun had fired. Time seemed to warp, to slow to a crawl. Ivan saw the shell coming. It wasn't a blur. It was a dark, solid object hurtling towards them, growing larger with impossible speed. It was going to hit them in the engine compartment. There was no time to think, only to react. He screamed a single useless word into the intercom. "Brace!" The world ended in fire and sound. The impact was not a loud noise. It was the universe collapsing. The force of the explosion lifted the rear of the 32-ton tank clear of the ground and slammed it back down. The concussion wave slammed into Ivan, throwing him against the hard steel of the turret with a sickening crunch. Lights exploded behind his eyes. His ears filled with a high-pitched ringing that drowned out all other sound. The fighting compartment filled with smoke and the smell of burnt insulation and fuel. For a moment, he was convinced they were dead, that this was the afterlife, a dark, smoky, pain-filled limbo. But then, through the ringing, he heard something miraculous. The engine was still running. It was coughing, sputtering, sounding like a man with a punctured lung, but it was running. The shell had been a high-explosive round, not an armor-piercing shot. The German commander, overconfident, had assumed a high-explosive shell would be enough to wreck the fragile T-34. He had been wrong. It had shredded the external fuel drums, started a fierce fire on the rear deck, and blown one of the track guards to pieces, but it had not penetrated the engine compartment armor. They were still mobile. They were on fire, but they were mobile. "Pavel, are you alive?" Ivan croaked, his own voice sounding distant and strange. A weak coughing sound came over the intercom. "Yes, Sergeant." "Then drive into the gully, now!" The T-34, now trailing flames as well as smoke, lurched forward the last few yards and plunged over the edge of the gully. It was a steep, jarring descent. The tank slid down the muddy bank, crashing through low-hanging branches before coming to a rest, partially concealed by the foliage and the geography itself. They were hidden. For the moment, they were safe. Ivan took a few deep, ragged breaths, his body aching in a dozen new places. They had survived the encounter with the tiger, but they were far from safe. The fire on the rear deck was spreading, licking at the hull. They were sitting on a potential funeral pyre. And the tiger knew where they were. It would be moving to a new position to get a clear shot into the gully, or worse, sending infantry to finish the job. They had traded a quick death for a slow, burning one. Ivan looked at the flames reflecting on the interior steel walls. The battle was far from over. In fact, their personal war had just begun, and their only weapon was a crippled, burning tank hidden in a ditch, with the enemy closing in from all sides. The heat was the first thing that registered, a palpable wave of it washing forward from the engine firewall into the fighting compartment. The acrid stink of burning diesel fuel and rubber was choking, a promise of the cremation to come. They had escaped the tiger's cannon, only to be trapped in a metal oven. Ivan's mind, still reeling from the concussive impact of the shell, fought through the pain and disorientation. Survival was now a series of immediate, critical tasks. The fire was priority one. "Pavel, fire extinguisher, now!" he barked, his voice hoarse from smoke and strain. He unstrapped himself from the commander's seat, his body protesting every movement. He could feel a sharp pain in his ribs where he'd slammed into the turret ring. Ignoring it, he clambered down into the lower hull. Pavel was already fumbling with the red cylindrical fire extinguisher mounted near the driver's station. His hands were shaking, his face pale beneath the grime, and a fresh trickle of blood from his forehead. Ivan snatched it from him. "I'll handle this. You, get on the machine gun. Watch the tree line. They'll send infantry." He didn't wait for a reply. Cracking the seal on the extinguisher, he aimed the nozzle at the base of the flames visible through the engine access hatch and squeezed the trigger. A cloud of white chemical powder billowed out, smothering the fire with a furious hiss. The immediate inferno died down, but tendrils of flame still licked from the ruptured fuel lines and the shredded insulation. It was a temporary fix at best. The T-34 was critically wounded, but it was still alive. As the white powder settled, a relative quiet descended, broken only by the crackle of dying embers, the hiss of hot metal meeting the damp air, and Pavel's ragged breathing. Ivan leaned against the radio set, wiping sweat and soot from his eyes. He took stock. They had no supporting infantry. Their tank was a smoking, crippled wreck, its mobility a temporary gift from his brutal repair job that could fail at any second. They were low on ammunition for the main gun, and they had just attracted the focused attention of the deadliest tank on the battlefield. The situation was, by any rational measure, hopeless. But in that hopelessness, a new kind of clarity was born. Ivan was no longer just a mechanic trying to save a machine. He was a soldier in command of the only Soviet asset on this sector of the front. The German advance was continuing unabated, just beyond the lip of the gully. He could hear the roar of other panzers, the crump of artillery, the desperate small arms fire of the Red Army's last stands. He had to think. He had to use the only weapon he had left, the terrain and the element of surprise. The tiger thought it had wounded them, driven them to ground to die. It would be cautious, but arrogant. It would not expect a counterattack from a tank it had already written off. Ivan's eyes, accustomed to the dim interior, scanned the controls. He was not a trained tank commander. He was a mechanic who knew how to make the machine work. But he understood principles. He understood angles, armor thickness, and weak points. The Tiger's frontal armor was impervious to the T-34 76mm gun at any range. Its sides were heavily sloped and still formidable. But the rear armor was thinner. The engine compartment was vulnerable. To hit it, he would need to get behind the beast. In this broken, confined terrain, that was a fantasy. Or was it? He peered through his vision slit, studying the gully. It was a shallow, winding scar, perhaps 10 feet deep in places. It ran roughly parallel to the German line of advance for a few hundred yards before curving away. If he could move through it, using it as a trench, he could potentially maneuver into a flanking position. It was a long shot, a very long shot. The grinding noise from the transmission was a constant reminder that his tank was living on borrowed time. Every meter of movement was a gamble, but to stay here was to die. He made his decision. "Pavel," he said, his voice low and steady, "we are going hunting." The young private turned from the machine gun, his eyes wide with a fresh wave of disbelief. "Hunting? Sergeant, with respect, we are on fire." "The fire is out," Ivan said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. "And the Germans think we are dead. That makes us ghosts. And ghosts can be very disruptive." He moved back to the commander's position, his mind already calculating angles and distances. He would have to navigate the gully by sight alone, a terrifying prospect with limited visibility. One wrong turn, one stuck tank, and they were finished. He engaged the gears. The transmission screamed in protest, a sound of pure agony, but the tracks bit into the soft earth of the gully floor. White 04 began to creep forward, a predator stalking its prey, moving silently, or as silently as a grinding, clanking, smoking tank can move through the hidden channel in the earth. They were no longer the hunted. They had become the hunters. But they were hunting a tiger, with a weapon that was falling apart in their hands, and the slightest misstep would bring the full weight of the German war machine down upon them. As they inched forward, the sound of the battle growing closer, Ivan knew their next encounter would not be one of escape, but of kill or be killed. And he had one shot, maybe two. He had to make them count. The gully began to curve, and through the trees he could see the hulking silhouette of the tiger, its side now visible to them as it methodically shelled a distant Soviet position. It was completely unaware of the ghost in the gully, lining up for a shot at its heart. The world inside the T-34 had narrowed to a single green-tinged rectangle, the gun sight. Ivan had taken over the gunner's position, his mechanic's eye for detail and alignment now serving a deadly new purpose. Pavel remained at the driver's seat, his job to hold the tank perfectly steady for the few critical seconds the shot would require. They were positioned at a bend in the gully, the nose of the T-34 nudging through a screen of broken birch trees. Less than 100 yards away, broadside to them, was the tiger. It was a colossal target, its slab-sided armor looking impregnable even from this angle. But Ivan wasn't aiming for the side. He was aiming for the rear of the turret, just above the engine deck. A shot there, with a little luck, could jam the turret ring, disable the engine, or even ignite the fuel. It was their only chance. The problem was the tree. A thick, low-hanging branch was directly in their line of fire. To get a clear shot, Pavel would have to inch the tank forward about 5 feet. 5 feet that would expose them completely, breaking their concealment. It was a deadly calculus. "Pavel, listen carefully," Ivan said, his voice a low, calm monotone that belied the adrenaline screaming through his veins. "On my mark, you will move us forward, very slowly, until I say stop. Then you will hold us rock steady. Do you understand?" A terrified gulp was his only reply over the intercom. "Pavel, yes, Sergeant, I understand." Ivan took a deep breath, his eye pressed against the rubber cup of the sight. The crosshairs wavered slightly with the tank's vibrations. He could see the German tank commander still in his cupola, confident, surveying his handiwork. He was shouting orders down to his crew, completely oblivious to the death poised in the gully behind him. This was it, the moment everything hinged upon. One shot. One perfectly placed shot from a gun that was not designed to kill this kind of monster. "Okay, Pavel," Ivan whispered. "Slowly now. Move." The T-34 creaked forward, an inch at a time. The grinding from the transmission seemed deafeningly loud to Ivan, though he knew it was likely drowned out by the Tiger's own engine and the general battle noise. The branch scraped along the front glacis plate. They were emerging from cover. The Tiger's massive rear end filled the gun sight. He had the shot. "Stop," Ivan commanded. The tank halted. The world seemed to hold its breath. Ivan's finger tightened on the firing trigger. He took up the slack. This was for the crew of White 04. This was for every burning T-34 he'd seen that day. This was for the motherland, for survival, for the simple, primal right to see another sunrise. He fired. The 76mm gun roared, a sharp, concussive blast that slammed the tank back on its suspension. The breech block smoked as it ejected the spent casing with a clang. For a split second, time stopped. Ivan watched the tracer round, a glowing red dot, fly straight and true across the short distance. It struck the Tiger square on the rear of the turret, right where he had aimed. A flash of light, a spray of sparks, a hit, a direct hit. But then, nothing. The Tiger shuddered from the impact, but its engine did not stall, its turret did not jam. The round had failed to penetrate. It had scarred the paint, maybe dented the armor, but it had not killed the beast. It had, however, gotten its full and furious attention. The German commander's head snapped around, his face a mask of shock and instant white-hot rage. He dropped down into the turret, slamming his hatch shut. The Tiger's engine revved, not in flight, but in anger. Its turret began to traverse, not with the slow deliberation of before, but with a violent, urgent speed. They were discovered, and this time the Tiger would not miss. "Reverse! Reverse now!" Ivan screamed, abandoning the gunner's position and scrambling back to the commander's cupola. Pavel threw the gears into reverse. The T-34 lurched backward, its tracks churning mud. But they were too slow, too clumsy. The gully was narrow, there was no room to turn. They could only back up, a retreat that felt agonizingly sluggish. The Tiger was already turning its hull, its tracks digging into the earth, bringing its devastating main gun to bear. It wouldn't even need to move. It could simply pivot and fire. They were trapped in a shooting gallery, and they were the duck. Ivan watched in horror as the long 88mm barrel lined up on them. There was no escape, no clever trick. This was the end. He felt a strange calm settle over him. He had tried. He had fought. He had taken his shot. It hadn't been enough. He thought of the green fields of his village, far from this hellish place. He closed his eyes, waiting for the final blast. But the blast didn't come. Instead, a new sound erupted from the German lines. Not the sound of a tank gun, but the sudden, frantic stutter of machine gun fire, the crump of mortar rounds, and the sharp, distinctive reports of Soviet PPSH-41 submachine guns. A counterattack! A desperate, local Soviet infantry charge had hit the German flank, distracting them. The Tiger's commander, faced with a more immediate threat from the infantry swarming near his position, made a split-second decision. The turret stopped its traverse, the barrel shifting away from the gully and towards the new threat. A burst of machine gun fire from the Tiger scythed through the advancing Soviet soldiers. It was a temporary reprieve, bought with Russian blood. But it was all Ivan needed. "Pavel, stop! Halt!" he yelled. They were still exposed, but the Tiger's attention was elsewhere. This was no longer about escape. This was about a second chance. The Tiger was now distracted, its side once again presented to them. But this time it was actively engaging other targets. It was vulnerable. But so were they. To take another shot, they would have to remain in this exposed position, a mere 100 yards from an angry Tiger. It was the riskiest gamble of all. Stay and fight, with the odds still overwhelmingly against them. Or use the distraction to flee deeper into the gully and live a few minutes longer. Ivan looked at the Tiger, then back at the grim, determined face of Pavel. There was no choice to make. They had come this far. They would see it through. He slammed his hand on the intercom. "Pavel, load an armor-piercing round. We're not done yet." The hunt was back on, but the Tiger was now wounded, angry, and knew they were there. The next few seconds would decide it all. The inside of the T-34 was a pressure cooker of fear and resolve. The reprieve was measured in heartbeats. Ivan, back at the gunner's station, could see the Tiger through his sight, its hull now angled towards them as it engaged the Soviet infantry. Its massive side glistened in the patchy sunlight filtering through the smoke. It was a better shot than the rear turret, but still a formidable target. The T-34's 76mm gun could penetrate the Tiger's side armor at this range, but it had to be a perfect hit, on a flat surface, not the heavily sloped parts. He had to pick his spot. "Round loaded!" Pavel's voice was a shrill cry over the intercom. He was performing the loader's job now, a task he was barely trained for, manhandling the heavy, oily shell into the breech. Ivan's mind was a computer of angles and trajectories. He ignored the machine gun bullets now pinging off their own hull from the German Panzergrenadiers who had spotted them. He ignored the tracers streaking past his vision slits. His entire universe was the gun sight and the colossal German tank. He saw his target, a spot just behind the front drive wheel, where the side armor was flat and housed the ammunition storage. A hit there could be catastrophic for the Tiger. He took a breath, let half of it out, and held it. His crosshairs steadied. The Tiger fired its main gun at the infantry, the blast momentarily obscuring it in smoke and dust. This was his moment. In the aftermath of its own shot, the Tiger's crew would be momentarily disoriented, dealing with the recoil and the smoke. He squeezed the trigger. The gun roared. The tank jerked. The shot flew true. This time, the result was different. There was a bright orange flash where the shell struck, not just a spark. A jet of flame shot out from the impact point, followed a split second later by a secondary explosion that tore the Tiger apart from within. Its turret, weighing over 20 tons, was lifted clean off the hull by the force of the internal detonation and thrown several feet into the air before crashing back down onto the chassis. A column of black smoke and fire billowed into the sky, a funeral pyre for the invincible beast. They had done it. They had killed a Tiger. For a moment, there was silence inside WWII, broken only by the crackling inferno of their victim. Then, Pavel let out a whoop of pure, disbelieving joy. "We got it! Sergeant, we got it!" Ivan didn't cheer. He felt a cold, hard satisfaction, but no joy. He had just killed 5 men. He had destroyed a masterpiece of engineering. It was a necessary act, an act of war, but it was not a cause for celebration. It was a cause for survival. And their survival was still very much in doubt. The destruction of the Tiger had a seismic effect on the local battlefield. The German infantry, who had been advancing confidently under the Panzer's protection, suddenly found themselves exposed. Their anchor was gone. Their invincible guardian was a burning wreck. The Soviet infantry, seeing the Tiger explode, found a new surge of courage. A ragged cheer went up from their lines, and they redoubled their attack, pushing the stunned Germans back. Ivan used the confusion. "Pavel, forward! Left stick, hard! Get us back into the gully, now!" The T-34 grumbled forward, turning away from the spectacular ruin of the Tiger and plunging back into the relative safety of the earthwork. They had won a battle, but not the war. The sound of the explosion would have been heard for miles. Every German commander in the sector would now know that a dangerous, rogue Soviet tank was operating behind their lines. They would be hunted. But for the first time, Ivan felt something other than desperation. He felt a flicker of hope. They had proven that Tiger could be killed. They had proven that one tank, even a broken one, could make a difference. The moral victory was immense, but the practical situation was still dire. His tank was on its last legs. The grinding from the transmission was now a continuous screaming keen. The engine temperature gauge was creeping into the red, the cooling system likely damaged by the fire and the shell impact. They were a ghost, but a ghost that was bleeding out. And as they moved deeper into the gully, seeking a new ambush position or a path back to Soviet lines, a new sound reached Ivan's ears. It wasn't the sound of a single tank. It was the sound of multiple engines, a chorus of deep-throated diesels. He peered through his vision slit, his blood running cold. Emerging from the smoke, advancing in a line abreast formation, were 2 more German tanks. They were not Tigers. They were Panzer IVs, older, more numerous, and with a weaker gun than the Tiger. But they were deadly enough to destroy WWII with ease. And they were fanning out, clearly searching for the T-34 that had just slain their king. They had traded one giant for a pack of wolves, and the wolves had their scent. The brief moment of triumph was over. The relentless chase was on again, and this time their luck felt thinner than ever, their tank closer to its final shuddering death. The 2 Panzer IVs moved with a practiced hunting grace, their commanders visible in their cupolas, scanning the terrain. They knew their prey was wounded, cornered in this network of gullies. They were methodical, professional, and they had the numbers. Inside WWII, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of tension. The euphoria of killing the Tiger had evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of being outgunned and outmaneuvered. Ivan's mind, however, was working at a fever pitch. He was no longer just a mechanic or a makeshift gunner. He was a tactician, reading the land like a map of death. The gully forked ahead. One path led deeper into a thicket, offering better concealment, but potentially leading to a dead end. The other path curved around a small hillock, potentially offering a flanking shot on the advancing Panzer IVs. It was a choice between hiding and fighting. Hiding would only delay the inevitable. The Germans would eventually find them. Fighting was suicide, but it was a proactive suicide. Ivan made his choice. "Pavel, take the right fork. Slowly, we are going to climb." The right fork led up a gentle, muddy slope. It was a risk. Climbing would expose their vulnerable underside armor and put immense strain on the failing transmission. But it was their only chance to get a positional advantage. The T-34 groaned and clanked its way up the incline, the engine whining in protest. Ivan kept his eyes glued to his periscopes, tracking the movements of the 2 German tanks. They had split up, one following the left fork, the other moving along the high ground above the right fork, trying to pin them in a crossfire. It was a classic pincer movement. They were being squeezed. The Panzer IV on the high ground was the immediate threat. It was slowing, its gun depressing, trying to get an angle into the gully. In moments, it would have a clear shot down onto their exposed top deck. They had to act first. "Stop!" Ivan commanded. They were halfway up the slope, partially exposed. The Panzer IV on the high ground was now broadside to them, about 200 yards away. It was a difficult shot, uphill through trees, but it was a shot. "Pavel, load AP, quick!" The young private scrambled, his movements clumsy with fear but fueled by adrenaline. The shell clanged into the breech. Ivan traversed the turret manually, the gears grinding. He had to lead the target, account for the slope. It was a gunner's nightmare. He fired. The shot was hasty. It slammed into the hillside just in front of the Panzer IV, throwing up a plume of dirt. A miss. The German tank commander, alerted, shouted an order. His tank began to reverse, seeking cover. But it was too late. Ivan had already identified his mistake. He hadn't accounted for the steep angle enough. He worked the breech, ejecting the hot casing. "Reload!" The second Panzer IV, hearing the shot, was now accelerating down the left fork, trying to get behind them. They were caught in the middle. Time was up. The Panzer IV on the high ground reappeared from behind a small knoll, its gun now leveled directly at them. Ivan saw the puff of smoke from its muzzle a fraction of a second before he felt the impact. The world dissolved into noise and force. The German shell hit them on the front glacis plate. It was a solid, armor-piercing round that, by some miracle, did not penetrate. Instead, it ricocheted upwards with a screech of tortured metal, gouging a deep furrow in the armor, but not killing them. The shock, however, was devastating. The concussion slammed Ivan against the gun sight, cracking his lip open. The electrical system shorted out, plunging the fighting compartment into darkness, save for the thin light from the vision slits. The engine coughed and died. Silence. A terrible, sudden silence, broken only by the drip of fluids and Pavel's soft, terrified weeping. They were immobilized, sitting ducks. The German tank on the high ground would now take its time for the killing blow. The one in the gully would soon be on them from behind. This was it, the end of the line. Ivan tasted blood in his mouth. He looked around the dark, dead tomb of the tank. They had come so far. They had killed a tiger. They had fought like demons. But it wasn't enough. The metal had finally given up. He could hear the distinct clatter of the Panzer IV's tracks as it maneuvered for the final shot. He closed his eyes, waiting for the darkness to become permanent. But then, a sound. A new sound. Not the sound of a tank gun, but the deep, thrumming roar of aircraft engines. Lots of them. A swarm of dark shapes descended from the clouds through the smoke haze. They were Stormoviks, Soviet IL-2 ground attack aircraft, nicknamed the Flying Tank. The German anti-aircraft guns suddenly opened up, tracers streaking into the sky. The battlefield, which had focused on the duel in the gully, erupted into chaos once more. The Panzer IV on the high ground, suddenly vulnerable to the rocket and cannon fire of the Stormoviks, frantically began to button up and seek cover. The one in the gully halted its advance, its attention divided. The sky had literally opened up to give them one last unexpected chance. Ivan's eyes snapped open. The engine was dead, but was it? He knew this machine. He knew its soul. He slammed his fist on the starter button. Nothing. He pumped the primer. He tried again. The starter motor whined, sluggish. "Come on, you beauty," he whispered to the metal around him. "Don't you die on me now." He pushed the button a third time. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then, with a sound like a dying man drawing a final ragged breath, it roared back to life. The lights flickered on. They had power. They had a few more minutes of life. The Stormoviks were strafing the German positions, giving them the cover they needed. It was a gift from heaven, a stay of execution. But they were still trapped between two enemies, in a crippled tank, with the entire German army now acutely aware of their presence. Their epic stand had become a legend in the making, but legends often have tragic endings. As the IL-2 screamed overhead, Ivan knew their reprieve was temporary. The Germans would regroup, and when they did, they would pour every available resource into silencing the Phantom T-34 that had become a symbol of Soviet resistance. The battle for the gully was over. The battle for survival was about to enter its final, most desperate phase. Ivan tasted blood in his mouth. He looked around the dark, dead tomb of the tank. They had come so far. They had killed a tiger. They had fought like demons. But it wasn't enough. The metal had finally given up. He could hear the distinct clatter of the Panzer IV's tracks as it maneuvered for the final shot. He closed his eyes, waiting for the darkness to become permanent. But then, a sound. A new sound. Not the sound of a tank gun, but the deep, thrumming roar of aircraft engines. Lots of them. A swarm of dark shapes descended from the clouds through the smoke haze. They were Stormoviks, Soviet IL-2 ground attack aircraft, nicknamed the Flying Tank. The German anti-aircraft guns suddenly opened up, tracers streaking into the sky. The battlefield, which had focused on the duel in the gully, erupted into chaos once more. The Panzer IV on the high ground, suddenly vulnerable to the rocket and cannon fire of the Stormoviks, frantically began to button up and seek cover. The one in the gully halted its advance, its attention divided. The sky had literally opened up to give them one last, unexpected chance. Ivan's eyes snapped open. The engine was dead, but was it? He knew this machine. He knew its soul. He slammed his fist on the starter button. Nothing. He pumped the primer. He tried again. The starter motor whined, sluggish. "Come on, you beauty," he whispered to the metal around him. "Don't you die on me now." He pushed the button a third time. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then, with a sound like a dying man drawing a final ragged breath, it roared back to life. The lights flickered on. They had power. They had a few more minutes of life. The Stormoviks were strafing the German positions, giving them the cover they needed. It was a gift from heaven, a stay of execution. But they were still trapped between two enemies, in a crippled tank, with the entire German army now acutely aware of their presence. Their epic stand had become a legend in the making, but legends often have tragic endings. As the IL-2s screamed overhead, Ivan knew their reprieve was temporary. The Germans would regroup, and when they did, they would pour every available resource into silencing the phantom T-34 that had become a symbol of Soviet resistance. The battle for the gully was over. The battle for survival was about to enter its final, most desperate phase. The roar of the Sturmoviks was a symphony of salvation and destruction. Rockets streaked from their wings, slamming into German artillery positions and supply trucks. Their 23mm cannons chewed up the earth, sending Panzer Grenadiers diving for cover. The sky belonged to the Red Air Force, if only for these few precious minutes. Inside White 04, the return of power was like a blood transfusion to a dying man. The lights flickered, the dials on the control panel glowed, and the engine settled into a rough but steady idle. The transmission, however, screamed its protest, a sound of pure metallic agony. They were mobile, but just barely. Ivan didn't waste a second. The Panzer IV on the high ground was preoccupied with the aerial threat, its turrets swiveling skyward as its commander tried to track one of the diving Il-2s. The Panzer IV in the gully had stopped, its hull hidden by a bend. This was their chance to break contact. "Pavo, reverse, down the slope, back the way we came," Ivan commanded, his voice raw. "We need to get to the main Soviet lines. Use the chaos." The T-34 groaned backward, sliding down the muddy incline they had just climbed. It was a clumsy, dangerous retreat, but it was movement. They reached the bottom of the gully and began to backtrack, following the winding path away from the two hunting Panzer IVs. The sound of aircraft began to recede as the Sturmoviks completed their pass and climbed away, seeking new targets. The respite was ending. Now they had to move through a no-man's land that was still very much active. The landscape was a nightmare tableau. The burning wreck of the Tiger was a beacon, marking their earlier triumph. Bodies of German and Soviet soldiers lay intertwined in the frozen mud. Abandoned equipment was scattered everywhere. The air was still thick with smoke and the sporadic crackle of gunfire. Ivan guided Pavel, his eyes constantly scanning through his vision blocks. They were a ghost ship sailing through a sea of the dead. Every bump, every lurch, felt like it would be the one that finally shook the tank apart. The grinding from the final drive was now so loud they had to shout to be heard over the intercom. It was a countdown to mechanical seizure. Then they saw it. A column of German half-tracks and supply vehicles hastily repositioning after the air attack. They were moving across their path, about 300 yards away, completely unaware of the T-34 lurking in the gully. It was a target of opportunity, a soft target. Ivan's finger itched on the machine gun trigger. He could cause havoc, disrupt their logistics, and maybe even cover their own escape. But engaging would reveal their position once more. It would draw every German soldier in the area down upon them. It was a tactical decision with moral weight. To fight or to flee. To be a soldier or to be a survivor. He looked at the column. He saw young German soldiers, no older than Pavel, clinging to the sides of the vehicles, their faces grim and tired. They were the enemy, but they were also men. He had killed today. He had destroyed a mighty weapon of war. Did he need to kill these boys too? The mechanic in him, the fixer, wanted the violence to end. The soldier in him knew that every vehicle destroyed was a blow against the machine that was trying to destroy his homeland. The choice was torn from him. A German officer in one of the half-tracks, his senses sharpened by battle, spotted the movement in the gully. He pointed, shouting an alarm. A machine gun on one of the half-tracks swiveled and opened fire. Tracers arced towards them, sparking off the rocks at the gully's edge. The decision was made for him. "Pavel, hard right, get us behind that ridge," Ivan yelled, returning fire with the Hull machine gun. The 7.62 millimeter rounds chattered, stitching a line across the lead half-track, shattering its windshield and sending the German soldiers diving for cover. It was a delaying action, nothing more. The T-34 turned, its tracks throwing up great gouts of mud, and lumbered towards a low earthen ridge that offered a temporary screen from the German column. But as they crested the ridge, Ivan's heart sank. The view that opened up before them was not one of salvation, but of a final, chilling confirmation of their fate. They were not behind Soviet lines. They were deep in the German rear. Stretched out before them in a shallow valley was a temporary German panzer repair depot. There were several damaged Mark IVs and even a Panther being worked on by crews of mechanics. Fuel drums were stacked neatly. Ammunition trucks were parked in a row. It was a target of immense value. But it was also a hornet's nest, and they had just stumbled right into the center of it. For a moment, there was a stunned silence from the German mechanics. They looked up from their work, their wrenches frozen in their hands, staring in disbelief at the battered, smoking Soviet green T-34 that had suddenly appeared on the ridge above them. They were looking at their own mirror image, enemy mechanics, caught in the open. Ivan and his tank were surrounded, outnumbered, and out of options. The long, desperate chase had led them directly into the lion's den. The ghost had been seen, and now the entire German army was about to descend upon it. The standoff on the ridge lasted only a second, a frozen tableau of mutual astonishment. The German mechanics, armed only with tools, were as vulnerable as sheep before a wolf. Ivan, in his wounded steel wolf, was surrounded by a pack of hunters. He had a clear shot into the heart of the depot. He could wreak unimaginable havoc. He could destroy precious fuel, ammunition, and critically needed repair equipment. He could set back the German advance in this sector by hours, maybe even a day. It would be a final, glorious act of defiance. But it would also be his last. The moment he fired, every German soldier in the vicinity would converge on their position. The half-tracks they had just engaged were already rallying, their machine guns finding the range. The two Panzer IVs that had been hunting them would be closing in from the rear. There was no escape from this rally. This was the end of the road. Ivan made his decision in a heartbeat. It was not the decision of a soldier, but of a human being who had seen enough death. He saw the fear in the German mechanic's eyes, the same fear he saw in Pavel's eyes every day. They were not frontline troops. They were his counterparts, men who fixed things, not broke them. He would not massacre them. "Pavel," he said, his voice eerily calm, "hold your fire. Do not shoot." "But Sergeant, They are mechanics, Pavel, just like us." He kept the Hall machine gun trained on the depot, a silent threat to keep the Germans pinned down, but he did not fire. Instead, he did something even more unexpected. He unlatched the commander's hatch and pushed it open, standing up in the cupola, fully exposed. The cold air hit his face, a shocking contrast to the oily heat of the tank's interior. He raised his empty hands. It was a gesture of surrender. Or was it? The German mechanic stared, bewildered. An officer, emerging from a truck, drew his Luger pistol but hesitated, confused by the Soviet tank commander's bizarre actions. Ivan wasn't surrendering. He was buying time. He was creating a spectacle, a distraction. Every second the Germans spent trying to figure out what he was doing was a second they weren't shooting. He could see the two Panzer IVs now, their noses appearing at the entrance to the valley, blocking their retreat. They were surrounded. But in that moment, Ivan saw something else. He saw the lay of the land. The depot was in a shallow bowl. The ridge they were on was the high ground. And to the left, there was a narrow, steep track leading up and out of the valley, a path probably used by supply mules or engineers. It was a desperate, near-vertical path. His tank, in its current state, could never make it. Or could it? His mind, the mind of a mechanic, saw not the impossibility, but the components. The engine had power. The tracks, though strained, had grip. The transmission was the wild card. It would either hold long enough to get them up that slope, or it would shatter into 1,000 pieces halfway up, leaving them hanging as perfect targets. It was the ultimate test of his repair. The ultimate gamble. He dropped back inside, slamming the hatch shut. "Pavel, see that track to the left? That is our road. Aim for it. Full power. Do not stop for anything." Pavel saw the path. His eyes widened. "Sergeant, we can't. It's too steep. The transmission will never." "It will!" Ivan roared, his patience finally snapping. "I built it. I know what it will do. Now drive." The T-34's engine bellowed, a final defiant roar that echoed across the valley. It surged forward, not towards the enemy, but towards the impossibly steep embankment. The Germans, recovering from their shock, opened fire. Machine gun bullets ricocheted off the rear hull. The Panzer IVs at the valley entrance began to advance, their guns seeking a target. But White 04 was already committed. It hit the base of the slope and began to climb. The angle was brutal. The front of the tank lifted, the nose pointing towards the smoke-gray sky. Inside, Ivan and Pavel were thrown backward, holding on to whatever they could. The engine screamed, the RPM skyrocketing. The grinding from the transmission became a shrieking, ululating wail, the sound of metal being tortured to its breaking point. They were halfway up. The tank was almost vertical. Ivan could see nothing but sky through the vision slits. He could feel the tracks losing purchase, sliding on the loose earth. They were going to tip over. They were going to roll back down into the valley and be destroyed. This was it, the final failed gamble. But then the tracks bit. The repaired final drive, Ivan's masterpiece of desperation, held. With one last gut-wrenching lurch, the T-34 crested the top of the ridge. For a moment, it balanced precariously on the edge, silhouetted against the sky like a mythical beast, smoke pouring from its engine deck. Then it tipped forward and crashed down onto level ground, out of sight of the Germans in the valley. They had done it. They had escaped the lion's den. But the sound that greeted them from the other side of the ridge was not the sound of safety. It was the thunderous barrage of a massive Soviet artillery preparation. The ground shook with a new, more organized violence. The Red Army was counterattacking. They had climbed out of the German rear and directly into the opening salvo of the largest tank battle in history. They were safe from the Germans behind them, but they were now driving straight into the steel storm of the Battle of Kursk's climactic phase. Their wild ride was not over. It was about to be subsumed by the titanic, history-altering clash of two armies. The world dissolved into a continuous, ear-shattering roar. The Soviet artillery barrage was a rolling thunder that made the previous hours of combat seem like a quiet argument. Shells of every caliber screamed overhead, tearing the sky apart and impacting in the German positions ahead with earth-shattering detonations. The very air seemed to be vibrating, thick with concussive waves and the smell of spent cordite. Inside White 04, the sound was a physical presence, a pressure that threatened to crush their skulls. Ivan and Pavel were momentarily deafened, their senses overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the violence. They had emerged from their desperate flight directly into the path of the Soviet counteroffensive. Through the vision slits, the landscape was a vision of apocalyptic fury. Geysers of dirt and fire erupted continuously. Trees were splintered into matchsticks. The sky was a dirty, boiling cauldron of smoke and flame. And through this hellscape, a wave of Soviet tanks was advancing. Dozens, then hundreds of T-34s, along with the heavier KV-1s and the new Su-152 assault guns, were moving forward at pace, their diesel engines adding a basso continuo to the symphony of destruction. They were no longer alone. They were part of the great steel tide of the Red Army. But they were also directly in its path. A charging T-34, its commander urging his driver on, swerved at the last second to avoid colliding with the battered, smoking wreck of White 04. The Soviet tanker gave them a bewildered look, a mix of respect and confusion, before plunging back into the smoke. Ivan understood. They were an anomaly, a ghost from a previous battle, drifting into the new one. They had to get out of the way or be trampled by their own side. "Pavel, move us to the flank. Find a spot to observe," he shouted, though he could barely hear his own voice over the barrage. The T-34, its transmission now emitting a continuous high-pitched whine that signaled its imminent and total failure, limped towards a small, shell-blasted copse of trees on the left flank of the advancing Soviet armada. It was a vantage point. From here, Ivan could see the entire battle unfolding. It was a sight that would be seared into his memory forever. The Soviet tanks crashed into the forward German positions, which had been softened by the artillery. The battle became a melee, a close-range brawl of titans. T-34s darted and weaved, using their superior speed and numbers to flank the slower, more powerful German Panthers and Tigers. German anti-tank guns fired until they were overrun. The air was filled with the tracers of machine guns and the fiery arcs of tank shells. Ivan saw a Tiger, isolated and surrounded, take hit after hit until it finally brewed up. He saw a T-34 charge a German anti-tank gun position, crushing it under its tracks. It was chaos, but it was a chaos the Red Army was winning. They had done it. Their stand, their desperate fight in the gully, had been a tiny, insignificant part of this larger picture, but it had contributed. By killing that Tiger, by disrupting the German rear, by simply surviving and forcing the enemy to dedicate resources to hunt them, they had made a difference. The tide was turning. The German spearhead was blunting, then breaking. A sense of immense, weary pride washed over Ivan. He had started the day as a mechanic in charge of a broken tank. He was ending it as a witness to history. But the war was not done with him yet. The mechanical scream from the transmission suddenly peaked, became a deafening, grating shriek, and then ceased entirely, replaced by a final, sickening crunch. The T-34 jolted to a halt, a dead weight. The engine, relieved of its load, settled into a rough idle. They had moved their last meter. WWII had given its all. Its final dying act had been to carry them to this vantage point, to let them see the victory they had helped to buy. It was over. The battle outside raged on, but their personal war was finished. They were safe, behind the lines of their own advancing army. Ivan leaned back in his commander's seat, the adrenaline draining from his body, leaving him feeling hollow and exhausted. He looked at Pavel, who had tears of relief and exhaustion streaming down his dirty face. They had survived. Against all odds, they had survived. But as the thunder of the battle began to slowly recede, moving west as the Germans retreated, a new sound reached Ivan's ears. It was the sound of boots on the ground, approaching their position. A squad of Soviet infantry, their PPSH submachine guns at the ready, was fanning out, cautiously surrounding the motionless, battle-scarred T-34. They didn't know whose tank this was. It was behind the lines, smoking, silent. It could be a German trick. Ivan saw the wary, battle-hardened faces of the infantrymen through his vision slit. They were pointing at the tank, communicating with hand signals. One of them, an officer, gestured for them to come out. Their ordeal was over, but a final, tense confrontation awaited them outside the steel walls of their crippled savior. After everything they had been through, would they be cut down by their own men in a case of mistaken identity? The world outside the tank was suddenly very quiet, the roaring battle now a distant thunder to the west. The immediate silence was filled with the cautious footsteps of the Soviet infantry squad and the labored idle of WWII's dying engine. Ivan knew this moment was fraught with danger. In the fog of war, a lone, battered tank behind the lines could be seen as a threat. He had to de-escalate the situation immediately. "Pavel, slowly now," Ivan said, his voice a low, calm instruction. "We are going to open the hatch. Keep your hands where they can see them. No sudden movements." He took a deep breath, unlatched the commander's hatch, and pushed it open. The cold, smoke-tinged air felt like a blessing. He raised his empty, grease-blackened hands high into the air. "Tovarishi, comrades," he called out, his voice cracking. "We are Soviet, crew of WWII." The infantry squad leader, a hardened lieutenant with a sharp face and tired eyes, kept his submachine gun trained on Ivan. His men fanned out, their weapons pointed at the hatches. "Identify yourselves, regiment and unit," the lieutenant barked. Ivan gave their unit designation, his name and Pavel's. He kept his hands raised. "Our tank is disabled. We have been fighting since morning. We killed a Tiger." The last sentence was spoken not as a boast, but as a simple statement of fact, a piece of data to validate their story. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed, then flickered over the tank. He took in the horrific damage, the scarred and dented armor, the shredded track guard, the blackened, fire-damaged engine deck, the fresh gouge from the Panzer IV's shell on the front glacis. This was not a tank that had retreated. This was a tank that had been through the very gates of hell and back. He lowered his weapon slightly. A few of the other infantrymen did the same, their suspicion giving way to a dawning respect. "A tiger, you say?" the lieutenant asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. Just then, a commotion came from behind the infantry squad. A group of men was approaching, led by a high-ranking Soviet colonel, his uniform stained with mud but his bearing erect and authoritative. He was followed by staff officers and a political commissar. They had been observing the battle from a nearby command post and had seen the crippled T-34 limping to this position. "Report, Lieutenant," the colonel said, his voice deep and commanding. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept over White 04, taking in every detail of its battle damage with a professional's appreciation. The lieutenant snapped to attention. "Comrade Colonel, this tank crew claims to be from the 1st Guards Tank Army. They say their tank is disabled and that they killed a tiger." The colonel's gaze shifted to Ivan, who was still standing in the hatch, his hands now lowered but held visibly away from his body. The colonel's eyes were not suspicious. They were curious, analytical. He walked closer, circling the tank like a sculptor inspecting a masterpiece. He ran a hand over the shell gouge on the front plate. He peered at the makeshift cable and track link repair on the final drive, his eyebrows rising in astonishment. He saw the dozens of machine gun impacts and the blackened paint from the fire. Finally, he stopped and looked up at Ivan. "Senior Sergeant," the colonel began, his tone neutral, "this repair on your drive sprocket, it is unorthodox. Who is responsible for this?" Ivan swallowed, his throat dry. "I am, Comrade Colonel. I am the mechanic." A long silence followed. The colonel looked from Ivan's tired, grimy face to the brutal, effective, and utterly insane repair job. He then looked out towards the west, where the sound of the victorious Soviet advance was slowly fading. He looked back at the tank, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. "Senior Sergeant," he said, his voice now filled with a warmth that seemed to defy the cold landscape, "do you have any idea what you have done? We have had reports all afternoon from forward observers about a single T-34, a ghost, wreaking havoc behind German lines, disrupting a panzer assault, destroying a Tiger, drawing enemy units away from the main front. We thought it was a myth, a story the men were telling to boost morale." He stepped forward and placed a hand on the tank's scarred hull, a gesture of profound respect. "But it was not a myth. It was you." The colonel turned to his commissar and staff. "This tank and this crew are to be given full honors. I want their story documented, every detail." He then looked back at Ivan, his expression one of sheer awe. "You, Senior Sergeant, did not just fix a tank. You turned a broken machine into a legend. You may have just turned the tide of this battle." The weight of those words settled over Ivan. He had been focused on survival, on the next second, the next repair, the next threat. He had never considered the larger picture. Now, standing in the hatch, surrounded by the evidence of their impossible journey, with a Red Army colonel hailing him as a hero, the full magnitude of what they had accomplished finally hit him. They had not just survived, they had become a symbol. But as the colonel's staff began to swarm around the tank and as medics arrived to attend to Pavel's wounded arm, Ivan felt a profound exhaustion overtake him. The adrenaline was gone, and in its place was a deep, bone-weary emptiness.
The scene around White 04 transformed from one of imminent threat to one of bustling, respectful activity. Medics gently helped Pavel down from the driver's hatch, cleaning and bandaging the gash on his arm and the cut on his forehead. He was pale, shivering from shock and exhaustion, but a look of dazed pride was beginning to replace the terror in his eyes. Staff officers were taking notes, sketching the damage, and marveling at Ivan's makeshift repair with the reverence of archaeologists discovering a lost artifact. The colonel remained, his hands clasped behind his back, watching Ivan. He saw the way the senior sergeant looked at his tank, not as a piece of military equipment, but as a living entity, a comrade. "She will not move again, will she, Sergeant?" the colonel asked softly. Ivan shook his head, his gaze still fixed on the motionless beast. "No, Comrade Colonel. The final drive is destroyed. The engine, it is only running now because it does not know how to die, but it will." His voice was thick with emotion. "I need to shut her down, properly." The colonel nodded in understanding. "Of course."
Ivan climbed down from the hatch for the last time. His legs were unsteady, his body a map of bruises and aches. He walked to the rear of the tank, to the engine compartment. The heat was still intense. He opened the access panel, the metal hot to the touch. He looked in at the V12 diesel, now coughing and sputtering, its lifeblood of oil and coolant leaking onto the ground. It had given everything. It had carried them through impossible odds, up impossible slopes, and had delivered them to safety at the exact moment it was needed most. It was a hero. With a practiced, gentle hand, Ivan reached in and closed the fuel shutoff valve. The engine's ragged rhythm faltered. It coughed once, twice, and then fell silent. The sudden quiet was profound. The great, wounded heart of WW2 had finally stopped beating. A wave of grief, unexpected and powerful, washed over Ivan. He leaned his forehead against the warm, scarred armor of the engine deck, his shoulders slumping. He wasn't just mourning a machine. He was mourning the crew who had originally manned it. He was mourning the innocence of Pavel, forever lost in this field of fire. He was mourning the men he had killed, German and Soviet alike. He was mourning the world that had required such sacrifices from mechanics and farmers and students. The colonel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Come, Sergeant, you have done enough, more than enough. You and your tank have written a page in history today that will never be forgotten." Ivan straightened up, wiping his face with a sleeve that was already black with grime. He took one last, long look at WW2. It was no longer a weapon of war. It was a monument, a testament to the stubborn, unyielding will of the human spirit. It was a symbol that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one man, with skill, courage, and a refusal to surrender, could make a difference. He was led away from the tank, towards a waiting staff car that would take him and Pavel to a field hospital and then to a rest area. As he walked, he passed columns of fresh Soviet troops moving up to the front, their faces grim and determined. He saw the looks they gave the battered, silent hulk of WW2, and the whispers that followed him. The story was already spreading. The legend of the ghost tank and its mechanic was being born. He had set out that morning to fix a broken sprocket. He had ended the day by helping to fix a broken battle line. But as he was driven away from the front, the sounds of war finally fading behind him, a single thought echoed in his mind, a thought that was both a comfort and a curse. It was over for him, but for how many others was the nightmare just beginning? The war was vast, and his was just one story among millions. Yet, as he looked at the determined faces of the men heading towards the sound of the guns, he knew that stories like his were the embers that kept the fire of resistance burning. He had done his part. Now it was someone else's turn. The field hospital was a world of stark contrasts. The sterile smell of antiseptic fighting a losing battle against the pervasive odor of mud, blood, and damp wool. It was a place of quiet agony, filled with the muffled moans of the wounded and the brisk, efficient movements of the nurses. Ivan and Pavel were given cots in a corner, their injuries deemed minor compared to the shattered limbs and torn bodies around them. Cleaned up, his wounds dressed, and wearing a fresh, if ill-fitting, uniform, Ivan felt like a stranger in his own skin. The constant roar of battle was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that rang in his ears. Pavel slept fitfully nearby, his dreams undoubtedly haunted by the day's horrors. Ivan couldn't sleep. He lay on his cot, staring at the canvas ceiling of the tent, his mind replaying the events of the last 24 hours in a relentless, vivid loop. The feel of the wrench in his hand, the sound of the grinding transmission, the sight of the Tiger's turret flying into the air, the faces of the German mechanics, the impossible climb out of the valley, the final, respectful silence of his tank. It was all there, burned into his memory forever. He was a hero. The colonel had said so. The political officer who had interviewed him earlier had said so, his eyes gleaming with the propaganda value of the story. But Ivan didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired, profoundly, deeply tired. He felt the weight of the lives that had been lost, both given and taken. The mechanic in him wondered if he could have done something differently, built a better fix, been faster. The soldier in him knew he had done what was necessary. The man in him just felt hollow. A few days later, they were transferred to a rest camp behind the lines. It was here that the legend began to truly take shape. A reporter from Krasnaya Zvezda, the Red Army newspaper, sought him out. The story of the mechanic who had turned a crippled tank into a one-army wrecking crew was too good to be true, and it was. It was being polished, shaped, and mythologized. Ivan gave a flat, factual account, downplaying his own role and emphasizing the performance of the tank and the bravery of Cavell. The reporter, however, had a narrative in mind. The next day, the newspaper came out. There, on the front page, was a dramatic artist's rendition of a T-34, looking pristine and heroic, charging through a horde of faceless German soldiers. The headline read, "One tank against the fascist horde, the hero of Kursk." Ivan's name was there. His story, or a version of it, was told to the entire Soviet Union. He was given a medal, the Order of the Red Banner, in a small ceremony. He stood at attention, the weight of the metal disc heavy on his chest, as a general praised his indomitable will and technical genius. Men he didn't know clapped him on the back, calling him a hero. But the cheers felt distant, muffled, as if he were hearing them from underwater. He had done what he did to survive, and to help his comrades survive. The fame felt like a suit that didn't fit. The war ground on for 2 more brutal years. Ivan Kravchenko, the hero of Kursk, was never sent back to the front lines. His story was too valuable. He spent the rest of the war traveling to tank factories and training battalions, a living testament to Soviet ingenuity and courage. He taught young mechanics not just how to fix engines and transmissions, but about the spirit of the machine, about the bond between a soldier and his tank. He told them that no tank was ever truly beyond repair if you had the will to fix it. He never saw White 04 again. He heard it was eventually stripped for parts, its husk left to rust in the field where it had made its final stand. That was fitting, he thought. Monuments were for politicians. The real monument was in the hearts of the men who had fought and in the lessons passed on to the next generation. When the war finally ended, with the red flag flying over the Reichstag in Berlin, Ivan returned to his village. He went back to being a mechanic, fixing tractors and farm equipment. He rarely spoke of the war. The medal he kept in a small wooden box at the bottom of a drawer. The memories he carried with him every day. The Battle of Kursk had been the turning point on the Eastern Front. The German war machine never fully recovered from the defeat. The Soviet victory there paved the way for the long, bloody march to Berlin. Historians would analyze the strategies, the numbers, the decisions of generals and marshals. But they would also tell the story of Senior Sergeant Ivan Kravchenko. They would speak of how, at a critical moment in the largest tank battle in history, the outcome did not hinge on a grand tactical maneuver, but on the grit, skill, and unyielding determination of one man with a wrench. It was a reminder that history is not just made by the famous and the powerful in their command bunkers. It is forged in the mud and the blood by ordinary men and women who, when faced with impossible odds, discover they are capable of the extraordinary. The tide of the battle was turned not just by armies, but by individuals. And on that day, near the city of Kursk, it was turned by a tank mechanic.